just want to thank Lindsay and Yvonne and Pavan, and also all my friends and family for being here today. I'm coming to you from room 1204, the wonderful biology lab in the Scarf building. And, you know, when I was thinking about where I wanted to have this webinar or Zoom, I thought, why not 1204? Because many of us here today are teachers and we've worked in labs, and this is our space. So we have tornado tubes in the background. We've got some nice little mealworms in the back. And then I just want to turn, I'm going to turn because I'm so proud of our fish tanks there in the back. And Doug, we have axolotls, we have a huge tank of, Doug is on the screen here. He's responsible for all these babies. And we also have fish. So I wanted to share with you this wonderful space. I'm so excited to actually be here with you today and to have this opportunity to share stories. And I love to start with this slide because I think it's really important how we identify ourselves as educators and those of us who love anything to do with the more than human world. And the idea of being, rather than an activist, which we are, and taking action, which we do, I call myself an orca lover because I love the orca. I call myself a defender because that's what we do. You know, we defend. And a protector, that's what we do. And I think that's it as educators. That's who we are. So I wanted to share, I always share that with my very first slide. And I have to recognize a Musqueam elder, Larry Grant. He really inspired me to think about the land acknowledgement and how we can create a land acknowledgement that's meaningful for us. And he suggests that we share stories, and that's what we're going to be doing today. I kind of think of this whole presentation as a land acknowledgement for the Salish Sea, because what we're doing, we're sharing the stories of the more than human as well as the human. And Dr. Grant talks about thanking and welcoming. And not only do the humans of this land, the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam people, but also who else is welcoming us to the land? Who else should we thank for having us on the land? And of course, for me, it's the Southern resident orcas. They are also welcoming us to this land. We have to think about their First Nations too. They're indigenous to this land, the human and the more than human. Getting out the stories can be challenging, specifically, I think, particularly for people who love the science of it. And so I wanted to share with you in the last few months, some really interesting scientific papers have been published. And one of them, Dr. Michael Weiss, talked about this article, which many of you may have seen because the Vancouver Sun and different publications showed it on their website. And 2023, nice and recent, talking about the costly lifetime maternal investment in killer whales. And what Michael Weiss talked about in this article was the fact that killer whale moms spend their whole lives with their families, specifically their sons. It's a lifetime bond. And they found it's very tiring for the mom. And I remember sharing this with my daughter, Celicia, and she goes, "Mom, you don't have to tell me that." You know, she's got 2 young boys. And so she said, yes, I can totally relate to that article because yes, it's very tiring for moms to have kids. So that kind of research has come out recently. And also another piece that came out in February was the idea of the Southern resident killer whales not getting enough to eat. Now we know that, but this piece came out showing that in the last 6 of the 40 years, they just haven't had enough food. So as scientists, as educators, we love sharing these kinds of pieces, but how do we actually translate that into education so everybody understands what we're talking about? So there's lots of interesting quantitative data that comes out, and the most recent, I think, was the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES report. There's biodiversity loss. This is part of the problem. We know that the Salish Sea is in danger. A bit of it, posters come out with lots of data, kind of a little bit gloom and doom, lots of information. can be mind-boggling for some people to look at that, and actually depressing. The government has to weigh in, of course, and they've come up with ways to protect the southern resident killer whales, and, you know, talking about interim sanctuary zones and no fishery zones, and how close we're allowed to get. So we have lots of data there that we can share as educators. And there's also lots of data just on other kinds of reports and from other areas about, you know, their habitat, what's going wrong, what's affecting them, the water quality, not enough food, and why the present salmon right now aren't healthy for them. They just don't have enough fat. Lots of data there. And then, of course, you know, how do we protect them? More data there, you know, keeping our distance, no fish zones, it's all there. But, you know, this kind of data is a bit mind-boggling. There's so much of it. So as educators, how do we make sense of it? And how do we share the stories? The recent UN bio conference that just happened in December was a good one, because I said, you know what, we're going to, by 2030, we're going to protect 30% of the world for biodiversity. We're going to try and stop biodiversity loss. That's good. That's good news. But you know what I find really exciting is when I read something like this on Twitter. And this is from the Orca Behavior Institute. And it's just so exciting because 50 orcas, they're probably southern residents, and they're coming down from Race Rocks this evening. You know, get onto your hydrophones, go onto Facebook, check it out. And this is what's exciting. All the scientific data is wonderful. We love it. But this is how we get people excited, sharing the stories. And who was there, of course, in that group was Haishka and her calf. So exciting. And then we get the report from Orca Network, you know, and they tell who was here, what were they doing? And of course, you have to have the beautiful, charismatic megafauna, even though T49A1 is a transient. We'll talk about transient or Biggs killer whales as opposed to southern residents. He's just so beautiful. So I had to include him. You know, these kind of, this is what gets people excited. Who was here? Where can I see them? Oh my gosh, you know, JPod was here. It's so exciting. Link to Facebook video. This is what gets people excited because they can listen to and they can share the stories themselves. So the big problem, and as teachers, you know, and as researchers, we talk about what's the problem? Well, the big problem is climate and nature emergency. That's a big problem. So through the slides that we just saw, we're looking at biodiversity loss and we're looking at mass extinction. And so how can we fix that as educators? Well, we know as educators, one way is through education. And specifically connecting with communities in our own backyard. So that's the bioregional piece. That's why the land acknowledgement is so important when you talk about your own community and you situate it within that community, the bioregional piece. And then for us, in this presentation, it's about the Salish Sea, and then it's sharing the stories of ocean optimism. You know who really inspires me is Rachel Carson. I love her work. She was a lover of the intertidal zone, as I am, and she talks about a sense of wonder and how we all have it within us and how we can actually bring it out in others. And I think as scientists and as educators, this is what we do. So the idea of the companionship of at least one adult, that's us as teachers. And I'd also like to think that that companionship is not necessarily always the human. It's also the more than human. And it doesn't have to be what we would consider technically living. This could be like a place, a mountain, the sky, the water, that are companions. And so I love Rachel Carson's work, and just thinking about it, thinking about the work of Lawrence Paul Uxwelipton. And he really captures the essence of the other, the more than human who walk with us, the ancestral spirits. Those are our protectors, but they're also our companions. And this work I love. I took this picture at the Museum of Anthropology when he had his exhibition there a few years ago. We'll see some more of his work in a minute. So Laura knows, because I talked about Spark the spark bird. And I'm a lifelong birder. I've been a birder all my life. And we always talk about in the bird community, what was your spark bird? Well, I know my spark bird. And if anyone knows this bird, please pop that in the chat. I'm interested if you know. I'll let you think about it. Let me talk about spark bird. So the spark bird is the bird that you remember that really got you wanting to know more. I saw this on my way home. I remember it so well, coming home from school in grade 2. And we lived in West Vancouver in the British properties, and there were no homes up there, and except for ours and a few others. And I remember walking home from school, and there was this bird. I didn't know what it was. This is grade 2. And I thought, and I remember that bird as it happened yesterday. And I will tell you, that is my spark bird. There have been many more since, but that's really got me thinking about, I want to be a birder. Okay, I see it's
Sandra, I'll
popped.
just let you know that Laura in the chat
Yes.
said Donatricia capensis copeton.
Oh,
Latin
Laura.
for your spark bird, or is that Laura's spark bird? Oh, it's
Yeah,
Laura.
Laura, share your spark bird. Is that your spark bird?
Yes, it is my spark bird.
That's great.
It's a bird really common in Colombia, especially in Bogota, and they're so cute. And I like it motivates me like to understand more about nature. So I get the feeling.
That's wonderful. Okay. The idea of learning in nature, learning from nature, and this is eco-pedagogy. This is what inspires me. The idea of nature as master teacher. And then within that, thinking about the language of animacy. And so our key and kin from wonderful writer Robin Wall Kimmerer, thinking about the more than human as our key and kin through the language of animacy. The idea of sharing the stories. And these are spark stories. And the idea of pedagogical witnessing, that's what we do as teachers. What we do as teachers is that we share the stories, and it's a kind of action, and it's pedagogy, and it's witnessing. And that is what we do when we share the stories. And I love this quote from poet and theologian Padraig Otuama, who talks about not only, sharing our stories, but it helps us pay attention to the great world narrative of stories. So spark stories. So let me share some spark stories from the Salish Sea with you. These are some spark stories that I remember so well. And the first one, Scarlet J50 and Sonic J52. So that wonderful half shell with the bubbles in it, it just shows us kind of the temporal world. Like those bubbles didn't last very long, they were there and then they were gone. And that idea, we have to hold on to the stories because they won't always be there if we don't share them. And then the Scarlet and Sonic, these two wee whales who both from the southern residents, killer whales, J-pod, who we'll meet today, and who lost their lives very young. And that grief, those sad stories are just as important as the happy stories. And so I wanted to share their story with you today, and we'll talk more about them later. But the ones on the bottom, the two sea stars, we have a purple star there, and then we have the big pink star. And whenever I go on a beach walk and there's been a storm, there are always so many animals that have been thrown up on the beach. And so I'm just dedicated to getting those animals back into the water and to make sure that they have a good life. And so I feel that's part of my action, part of the way that I take action on behalf of the more than human. And so Doug's on the screen today, and I would always say to Doug, after a good day of getting everyone back in the water, I'd always say to Doug, "Oh, how many sea stars do you think we saved today?" And of course, you know what Doug would say. Doug would say, "No, you didn't save any today, Sandra." They probably all died. But the fact that we actually had the opportunity to feel that we're making a difference, it was important. The big guy in the middle. Does anyone recognize that fish there? Does anyone know what kind of fish we have there? some of you who live near the Salish Sea will recognize this fish. And Doug and I were walking along the beach, and that's exactly what it looked like. You know, it was up there on the beach, dried out. It's a story flounder, by the way. And they have the most wonderful story to share. You know, they're born normally, their eyes move. They have this migrating eye that moves over to the other side of the body. That's why he's a flatfish. And I said to Doug, I'm going to save that fish. He said, oh, for heaven's sake, that's never going to happen. Look at that fish. He's dried out. He's not moving. I said, I don't care. I'm just going to try. So I picked him up and got him into the water and just sort of got the water moving, got the water over the gills. What do you think happened? What do you think happened?
He swam away.
Yes, it was wonderful. It was wonderful to see that little guy swim away. And it just sort of, you know, got me thinking that we can make a difference, even though we may not think we can. So the idea of it's hard to fight for what you don't know you've lost. And that in part is how, you know, sharing the stories is so important, because what we're doing when we share the stories is we're creating a baseline, as Derek Jensen talks about, but it's like that ecological autobiography of ourselves, what we've experienced in our lives, and also an ecological biography, and those of our kin and kin. So there are sad stories like the story of Scarlett and Sonic. There are those stories that go so quickly that we have to seize them and share them. And then there's stories of hope and stories of action and stories of success, like our pink and purple stories. I think we did a good job with those, and also the story flounder. Granny's story. That's what really got me thinking. I want to know more. And does anyone know anything about Granny? If you do, put it. I've got the chat up now, and I can see if you know anything about Granny. Granny, as you can see, was the matriarch of J-Pod. She lived a long life. Now, there's some controversy around her age, but I'm sticking with this age because it just shows you that idea of the elder wisdom, and the idea of that her spark story is just so inspiring. And Granny's story is the one that really got me thinking that I really want to know more about the Southern residents, and I want to share their story. So Granny, now the Southern residents, and maybe someone can put in the chat, do you know the 3 pods of the Southern residents? Anyone know the 3 pods? There, J is 1. What do you think comes next? J, what do you think comes next, alphabet wise? How about K? Yes, very good. Thank you. Thanks, Yvonne. Thanks, Faye. And what's next? Oh, yes, L. Thank you. J, K, and L. So Granny, now the matriline means, okay, the Southern residents are a matrilineal culture. So Granny, being the eldest, she's with her beloved matriline. So those are the whales who are closest to her in terms of genetics, like her daughters and her sons and her granddaughters. So Granny was the matriarch of the whole J-pod, and actually the whole J, K, and L clan, because she was probably the oldest whale, but matriarch of J-pod. And so the J-pod always would stay together. Granny was in the lead, so she'd be the one who would always be at the front of the pod when they came to visit in the Salish Sea. That idea of elder wisdom is so important. And this is where Granny would hold that. And I love what Larry Grant says. You know, he says, let's use the term knowledge sharers rather than knowledge holders, because what we're doing is we're sharing it. We're not keeping it to ourselves. And that's what Granny did. The idea of, she'd always be in the front. So whenever the whales were traveling, and they hundreds of kilometers, there's Granny right in the front. She would choose where to fish. So we're going to stop here, we're going to do some fishing, where we're going to rest, who's going to mate with whom. This is the role of the matriarch. And this story was so compelling to me because of all the knowledge that Granny shared, and the fact that she would pass that knowledge down to other members of the pod. And she was always with her, I'm going to say son, but I'm going to put that in quotation marks right now. The idea, her son Ruffles. And you can see when these animals were, when the whales were first identified in, by Mike Bigg, really, who did the work in the 70s, Granny was called J2 and Ruffles was called J1. And it was just for size. So you can see Granny was actually the eldest. And at the time we thought that Ruffles was Granny's son. Now, because they were always together, right? Because killer whale moms spend their whole lives with their sons right by their side. And then there was also Onyx, who was always with Granny as well. And Onyx had a really interesting story. He was an L-pod whale, as you can see, L87. And his mom died when he was only 5 years old, Olympia. And typically when a male killer whale dies in the southern resident clan, when the mom dies, the sons die soon after because they're very close to their moms and their moms take care of them. So it was quite interesting when Onyx lost his mom, Olympia. He was actually able to bond with other female elders in his pod. So he bonded with another whale and L pod, and then he bonded when that, unfortunately, the elders means they're older, and so the whale would pass. Then Onyx would bond with another whale. He went to K pod and bonded with a whale, and then eventually he bonded with Granny. So Granny and Onyx became very close, and he never left her side. Granny and Ruffles' story is really interesting, and I wanted to go back to that because for so many years, we thought that Ruffles was Granny's son because they were always together. But this is the beauty of science, the scientists figured out that Ruffles was not Granny's son. They had a very close relationship, but through genetic testing, they were able to see that Ruffles was not a J-pod whale. Ruffles was another L-pod whale, just like L87. And this was kind of mind-boggling, but in a way, it was a good thing because Ruffles was the dad of so many of the offspring in J-pod. So it's actually a good thing that he was not a J-pod whale, but an L-pod whale. But it just shows you how close the bonds are. And now that we know Onyx's story and Ruffles' story, we realize now that these whales will actually travel within the pod, the males will. So I'm going to put a question out to everybody. How do you think scientists figured out, like, how did they do the genetic testing? How does that happen? Like, what did they do to get that information? Okay, I'm going to give you some hints. Thank you, Yvonne. Yes. Poop. Now, how do you get the poop? Well, you get a dog. You get a poop sniffing dog. So and whale poop doesn't, it sinks. So you've got to get out there quickly. So Tucker was sort of the story that I was really connected with because he was a black lab and he was out there and he was always on the lookout for poop. And so within the poop, there's so many things that you can find, right? All these toxins and hormones. And so you can figure out who's related to whom and the health of the overall health of the whale as well. So that's where they get their information from, these poop sniffing dogs. Now, since that time, let me just go to the next slide here. There've been lots of dogs. Tucker retired and then Jack came on board. The current is Iba. And I love this. I thought you'd appreciate this about the conservation canine program, because there's so many dogs in shelters right now, and it's the the dogs have lots of energy and the high prey drive who end up in shelters. And so the conservation canines have been wonderful in assisting with southern residents and finding out how they're doing their health and well-being. And of course, Iba has her glasses on there because, it's bright out there on the water. So, and the reward, of course, is, for a successful poop find is they get a toy. The other way that we're getting wonderful story information is through technology. And the result of the work from what this is called a hexacopter, and it's specifically designed for work with the killer whales. The drone photography has really taken over the data collection for these for the information for the whales, and it's incredible, the kind of information from the drone photographs. Now, this is Dr. Michael Durbin, and he sort of the one who they work with NOAA, they work with Oceanwise, and they work with Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, to collect this data. I'm going to show you some. And this is the kind of information we get. Like, how many orcas are out there right now? Well, through drone photography, we can find out how many. You can see JPOD 24, KPOD 17, LPOD 34. That's it. 73 orcas in 2023. High mortality, probably a 60% rate of miscarriage for the mums. And then for whales to survive their first year, whale calves to survive their first year, it's about the same. So the fact that we're low to begin with, but this kind of technology gives us a snapshot into their stories. We also find out, what they're eating. And the southern residents love to eat Chinook salmon. That's their favorite. They'll eat other species, but they love Chinook. And the problem is that there's just not as many Chinook as there used to be. So the drone technology, we were able to collect data on what they're eating and what times of the year they're eating Chinook and other fish. These are some Chinook from 1910. And I think right away you can see maybe what the issue is, because this is what Chinook used to be, the size of us. And then just through overfishing and dilution of the gene pool through hatchery fish, they've just diminished in size. And so today, when adult killer whale would eat maybe 2 or 3 of those, maybe 4 in a day, and they're good. But today, now the fish are so much smaller that they would require quite a bit more salmon to eat. So that's part of the data that we're receiving from the drone photography is like, what they're eating and how much. And what's incredible, they love to share food. They're sharers. And so they catch a fish and then they'll take a little piece out of it and leave it for somebody. And so by the time they get to their piece, it's very small from a fairly large fish, because they love to share food. The wonderful piece about the technology is that the research has become ethically informed. And so no longer do people have to go out into the water. In the olden days, they were shooting the whales, shooting their dorsal fin so they could make a little ID. Granny always had a little cut out of her dorsal fin from where Mike Big actually took a piece out of it so he could identify her later on. Or you don't have to tag them. This way, this ethically informed research, you can get information about the whales just through drone. You can see the drone there in the reflection. And so what does that photography tell us? Well, it tells us who's pregnant. And it also tells us who belongs to whom, because it's such a close community that it's hard to tell who the mom is. And you have to wait for the whale to nurse to figure out, because there's so many aunties there helping out. And so they have to have these kinds of images to tell, okay, if so-and-so is nursing from so-and-so, that must be the mom. And also, as I said before, Mom Slick and her calf Scarlet, we're going to talk more about Scarlet, but who is traveling with whom, and that'll tell us and give us a good idea of who's related. And then also who's, the health and well-being of the whales. So these 3 whales from JPOD, and there's our Slick in the center, Eclipse on the left, J41, and then Princess Angeline on the right. And the body condition tells us so much. So, J41's pregnant, Slick is looking after her pregnancy, not as robust. And then Princess Angeline is not looking as well. And then more photographs will show us that when we look at Princess Angeline from 2015, and then the way her body has, diminished, and then she's got as you can see in the information, the peanut head. So I'm going to put a question out there now for you to think about. This happens to it's from malnutrition and many other things, but they're finding out that the female whales are living a bit longer with this condition than the males. The males are dying very young. They're dying in their 20s. Whereas the females, even though they're, in the same water and taking in the same toxins, tend to live a little bit longer. Even though they're just as toxic, I want you to think about, why do you think the females live a little bit longer than the males when there's this issue of malnutrition, toxicity? Anyone want to try and think about what makes females different from males, that they would be able to live a little longer with the same toxins? I want you to think about what females do. It's in this photograph right now. Yes, thank you, Lindsay. So they're mammals, they feed their young with milk. And so why would breastfeeding be an issue? Like, why would that actually help the female? And because males don't breastfeed, why would that be a detriment to their lifespan? What does breastfeeding do? You're passing on the toxins to the babe, releasing toxins. Yeah, the toxin gets passed to the baby. Exactly. And so that's the only reason really why the females live a bit longer when in the same toxic environment. But when you think of it, they're passing it to the babe. And then we just talked about the high mortality rate with the calves. So when a whale gets to the condition of Princess Angeline, the peanut head, what's happening is the starvation has come to the point where they're feeding off their blubber. And you don't want to feed off your blubber if your blubber is where the toxins are held. So if you're feeding off your blubber, you become toxic yourself. And what happens is that we lose whales. And so, yes, whales don't usually recover from peanut head, and we lost Princess Angeline. And then the same year we lost Scoter and Nissa. And, the grief is important to the stories, because that's how we connect that idea of we grieve these animals, and it's part of the ecological memory. And we have to share those stories too, even though they're painful. But those stories, as we look back, and we have to look forward. And I like the word hope, but I think the word resolve and optimism, that's where, as educators, and as I would like to think as scientists, we need to focus on. And the idea of sharing the stories in reciprocal and respectful ways. So thinking about how we do that, we have to share the sadness, but also share the hope, resolve, and the optimism. And there's our granny with her great grandcalf, Nova J51. The intergenerational piece is really important. And I think as educators, we have to focus on that, and that elder wisdom, elder knowledge piece. And going back to Rachel Carson's words that we started with about the sense of wonder, who is that companion? The companion is also an intergenerational companion. So not just their peeps, but our grandfathers and our grandmothers, and the human and the more than human. And Granny, that's her story, when she was, well, we'll get to that point because I don't want to talk until we get to her First People's principles. That's part of the culture of the Southern residents, matriarchal, matrilineal society. And they're always together. And there's Ruffles and Granny with J2 matriline. And the idea of the sharing of the salmon, and in this actually photograph, and I will say that these photographs are all from the drone. If there's a different photograph, I'll tell you where it comes from. These are from NOAA and OceanWise and DFO. So these are the drone photographs that they were able to use, and they put them on their website. So that's where I got those from. And you can see Granny sharing a salmon with her orphan J-pod, Saintchin. And Granny was dying at this time. Granny was showing peanut head at this time. But what's she doing? She's sharing her salmon, even though, she herself could have used the whole salmon. And then when Granny died, for me, my spark story, like with Granny, every year when the whales were offshore, because they move around a lot now because of the lack of food. When Granny died, every year I would say, when the whales came in, like when we would get that tweet that we started with, the whales are here and they're in Harrow Strait, or everybody would say, was Granny there? Because we knew that she'd be in the front. She was always in the front. And then one year Granny wasn't there. And it was devastating. And I think that everybody, the grief to lose Granny, but Granny lived a long life. And so we can take heart in that she had a long life, but her loss has been quite devastating for the Southern residents. And I quote Eva Salaidis's work here. She did a wonderful book on the Alaskan orcas, the Chukach orcas in Alaska. And she talks about, and that is a pod that's going into extinction. I think there's only 6 animals left. And that was because of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. But she talks about going into great silence. And that's what we want to make sure doesn't happen for our southern residents. But the loss of Granny was extremely detrimental to the pod. And then after Granny died, we had the tour of grief. And I'm sure maybe some of you remember this. This was so devastating. When Tahlequah, J35, she had her wee calf, T. Tahlequah. And I was up Point Roberts the day, and I was looking at my Facebook page, because that's what we do, because we're always wondering where the whales are. And then I remember saying to Doug, oh my gosh, new calf for J-Pod, because it's always so exciting. And then within minutes, the calf had died. Oh, I have to take a breath, because that is the grief piece that is so powerful. When we remember this, that's a spark story. The loss of that calf was just devastating. And not only did we lose the calf that day, did Tahlequah lose her calf, but she carried that calf on her rostrum. And this is a picture of her carrying her calf, who only lived 20 minutes. And she carried that calf for 1,600 kilometers. Now, I don't know if any of you remember this. It was all over. Everybody was talking about it. The tour of grief. Does she still have the calf? She needs to let the calf go. There was even people who talked about, should we take the calf away from her? No, she needs to live that story, and she needs to hold on to her calf until she's ready to let the calf go. And she did, after quite a few days. And I thought was really powerful here is that listening to the land and listening to the elders. And people talked about Tahlequah was sharing her story for a reason, and she carried her calf for 17 days for a reason. It was to show the world that we need to talk about what we're doing, and we need to do it differently. And I love what Elder Tom Sampson talks about from Sartlip First Nation. It's that our relationship with the ocean and the land. We need to rethink that. And we need to listen to Tahlequah's story. And what I loved about that is that the science people said, yeah, we do. Mom was grieving. For science people to say that. I mean, when I grew up in the world where science people would never anthropomorphize like that. There's Deborah Giles saying, yeah, that mom was grieving. And, it took the world by the heart. And I wanted to show you the mural for Tahlequah in Toronto, Ontario, where her story was devastating and took people by heart. Chief Ladybird posted this on her Twitter page. And it really brings to mind the idea of, the idea of two-eyed seeing, Western science, traditional science. And the article that Andrea Reed wrote on two-eyed seeing, and I have at the end of the presentation, is really wonderful because she talks about what that really is. And so where we share that common ground between Western science and traditional Indigenous science. And there's the R's, there's our First Peoples principles right there. And of course, I love the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. So I always have to add her as well. Just the idea of science polishes the gift of seeing. Indigenous traditions work with gifts of listening and language. Scarlet. So we lost T. Tahlequah. And then within a month, we lost Scarlet. This was so difficult for me. And there's our grief again, because the idea of the stories, the spark stories, there's great joy, but there's also, with great joy comes great sadness. Scarlet, if you remember, her mom was J16, Slick. And when Scarlet was born, with the drone photographs, they couldn't really tell who the mom was. And Scarlet was hanging out with quite a few different moms, lots of aunties. And so they saw her a lot with J16 or Slick. And then all the scientists said, well, there's no way that Slick is Scarlet's mother. There's no way. Now, why do you think people thought that Slick was not Scarlet's mom, even though they were together a lot? And I want you to put your human hat on here and think, why would someone think that a whale was not another whale's mom? What could possibly be the reason? I'm going to give you a hint. Slick was probably about 40 years old. That's a hint. What do you think? Why do you think they didn't think Slick was mom? Age. She was too old. And of course, she wasn't too old. Orca females do go through menopause. It's one of the few species who do. Whales, toothed whales, narwhals, belugas, primates. I think some pilot whales also go through menopause, but they just thought that Slick had gone through menopause. But no, she had this wonderful calf. Scarlet was her calf. Now, if you notice on Scarlet's body, there's some rake marks there, and no one's really too sure. They thought maybe Slick had a difficult birth. But Scarlet it's just an incredible whale. She had so much energy and joie de vivre. She loved life. She was always flying through the air. This is a very famous photograph by Clint Rivers, by the way. And people loved her because she was a little smaller, but she was always exuding this wonderful joy. And that ecological memory, her spark story, is so important to share because people loved her. And the last time I saw Scarlet, again, I was at Point Roberts, and Doug and I were up on Lily Point, and we're at the lookout. We looked out. I knew that the NOAA and Fisheries Canada DFO was in the area. The Vancouver Aquarium was in the area. The Lummi First Nation was in the area, and they were following Scarlet with Slick and J-Pod because they knew that Scarlet was dying. She was small, she was thin, she wasn't being able to keep up with her pod, and they didn't know what to do. Like, should we feed her? The Lummi brought Chinook for her to feed. The Vancouver Aquarium and DFO are thinking, should we trying to put antibiotics into her? How can we do that? What can we do? Everybody wanted to help, but nobody could. Nobody could help. And I remember just looking out on the lookout, and I saw J-Pod and Scarlet way back. She couldn't keep up anymore. And it just, talk about a spark story, a sad one, but we knew that there was nothing we could do for Scarlet. And of course she did die. And the sad part about it is that when she disappeared, and it was just the next day, Slick disappeared too. So Mom and Scarlet disappeared. And everyone went, uh-oh, she wasn't looking good yesterday. We couldn't help her. She wouldn't eat. She's gone. And they're worried about Slick too, because moms are close to their babes. But within a few days, Slick rejoined the pod, but Scarlet was not with her. So she must have let her go. But her story was so powerful that it just, again, just like Tahlequah's babe, just brought people together and to think about, we have to share that story and the empathy that we had with Tahlequah, T. Tahlequah, her babe, with Slick, with Scarlet. It's all part of the story. So as Robin Kimmerer says, you know, loving is great, but we really have to find ways to heal the orcas because they are going extinct and they're going to be like the chewjack orcas that I talked about in Alaska. We don't want to get down to 6 individuals. And that pod hasn't had a babe since the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So what can we do? Well, sharing the stories. And we have to share the good ones too. Remember Onyx? Well, when Granny died, and Granny and Onyx, as I mentioned before, were very close. He followed her everywhere. And when Granny died, and I want to share the story of Granny, how I felt when I learned that from Ken Balcom when he told the story. So J-Pod was coming down Harrow Street, and Granny was in the lead, as she always was. And I remember she was showing signs of peanut head, so they knew her time was near. And from the observations from Orca Research and Orca Network, she stopped. She turned around and she headed north, and J-Pod kept going. She had made her decision that it was time to leave. And the researchers knew that there was something up because before her passing, she spent a lot of time with other members of the pod, J16 Slick, mostly, and they felt this was she was passing on the elder knowledge, the elder wisdom at that time. So she was passing on what the next matriarch would need. The worry was for L87 Onyx because he disappeared after Granny died. And everybody, again, when J-Pod showed up, is Onyx there? And he wasn't. But he did show up again. And he has a really positive story. He has a really happy ending to his story because in 2019, he showed up again. And I had to show you this one. Onyx was down in Monterey Bay, in March. He has teamed up with L-Pod again. And he's hanging out with mostly the males for L-Pod. So he's had this amazing journey of always being with a matriarch, going through K-Pod and L-Pod, and then coming to Granny, and then with the loss of Granny, going back to his pod. So what a wonderful story of optimism. Because remember, the males often die after the mom dies, but Onyx was able to keep going. And so that was a story of wonderful hope and optimism and resolve, because that's true resolve, to just keep going. And then there are more good stories, right? We've had so many births since we lost Granny and Scarlet and T. Tahlequah. Whistle was born in 2019. And you notice how the calves are a little bit pinky? So if anyone would like to share in the chat why you think the calves are a bit pinky, you can share with us. And Whistle was born. And then, I had to show you just the idea of resolve, renewal, and optimism. Tofino, we had another calf was born, J56, little Tofino and little Pinky, the pink staining from birth. It stays for quite some time. They always know a calf is new because of the pinky. I want to get back, we'll talk about why they're pink in a minute, but I want to get back to Tahlequah's story, because what was really exciting is that she became pregnant again. And let me tell you, we were worried. When I found out she was pregnant again, I just took a big breath, because I was like, it's almost like you just don't want to know what's going to happen. But the beautiful thing is that she did give birth to Phoenix, J57, and just so exciting. She's a fantastic mom, and Phoenix is still with us today. So, and there he is. There's a little pinky boy there. When they're born, they don't have a big blubber layer. And so you can just see the blood vessels through the white pieces, that's all. And then when he gets fatter, and he'll lose the pinkiness as his blubber layer builds. And just the closeness of there's Phoenix with his mom, Tahlequah, together. And then J41, remember we had the picture of her with Princess Angeline and Slick, had a baby in 2020. Very exciting. These are also exciting. And the babe was a girl, which is so great because you want to have a nice balance. And then the closeness, and there's the drone photo, the reflection of the drone there, the closeness of the two of them. Haishka, we saw Haishka at the very beginning, born in 2022, so exciting, female, always good. And then there's Haishka with mom just this year, you know, she's doing well. And these are wonderful stories to share because they're important. And then Prosper, K45, with Mom Spock. And if you're a Star Trek person, that's why they're named that. I actually wanted them to call the girl Uhura. Those of you in Star Trek universe will understand. But Prosper, also good, with Mom Spock, born still today, doing well. And so always being, as Rachel Carson reminds us, the idea of wonder, and this wonderful quote from E.B. White, always be on the lookout for the presence of wonder because it's there. And through sharing of the stories, we can ignite, we can spark that wonder in others. And looking forward with optimism. And I wanted to show the picture of Ocean Sun, probably the oldest member of the Southern Residents right now, with her little grandbaby, and you know, because the pinky, L124 whistle. And Ocean Sun is the mother of Lolita, or Scalinatchanak, or Tokite. Have you heard of her story? What a story. Lolita was captured, as you can see on the right, in Penn Cove. And this is how they captured whales for display in aquariums. And I'm pretty sure when I look at this photo, I think this is Ocean Sun here. And this is Lolita here, little Tokite. Pretty much just put a net around the whales and, you know, took out the babes because they were easiest to transport. And most of those babes died in captivity, but Lolita, look, when she was captured, and she's still alive today. The exciting thing is she's coming home. They have a place for her in the San Juan Islands. This fellow, I never thought much of people who owned sports teams, but this man stepped up and he said, you know what, I'm going to pay for Lolita to go home, and it's time. And I hope you follow her story, because this is the first time, other than Keiko, but that a Southern resident is going to come home to her home waters. Her mother's still alive. She's a member of LPOD. They're not just going to pop her in the water. They're going to provide a spot for her. And if she doesn't want to rejoin her pod, she doesn't have to. But this will take some time to get her healthy again, eating on her own again, building up the muscle again. But it is an exciting story, and it's the way forward for captive orca. And it's really, and when people say, you know, the whale, it won't be successful. Lolita is in excellent health as it is. She's got lots of good teeth, which is important. And they really feel that this is going to be an important story for captive orcas, because Keiko actually did survive. The problem with Keiko is no one knew where his pod was. He was an Icelandic whale. They didn't know the home pod. So he actually did well. He started feeding himself, and he ended up in Norway, and he unfortunately died. But he did have a life on his own. And we're hoping this Lolita can rejoin her pod. So watch for this spark story, because I think it's going to be really exciting. Just a reminder what we've all been through and what happens when we disconnect from nature. And we have to see nature as our strongest ally. And there's so many pressures on nature. And we saw this in, you know, what happened with COVID is that the pressures on nature, and we went through that COVID and we're still going through it. We know what happens when things don't work well. And just the idea of why these whales are in crisis, we have to share those stories. But as people say, well, why should I care about whales? But hopefully, if we share the stories that we've done today, people will care that they're in an extinction vortex, and there's something we can do about it. Because if we love them and we grieve with them, it will compel us to love them more and to do more for them. I want to share with you this slide because I think this is a really important one. It was the most shared, the most talked about the most retweeted slide from the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I want you to look at this slide. I want you to think about why this was the slide. Why was this the slide that people talked about? And I know some of you already know this because I talked about the slide in a previous presentation, so feel free to put that in the chat. But this is the one that of all the data that came out of that panel, this is the one they talked about. Well, when you look at this slide, put it this way, when you look at this slide, what are you looking at or for, or? Thank you, Faye. I knew Faye. Yes, that's right, Lindsay. Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Lindsay. We can locate ourselves in this slide. Where am I? Oh, there I am. I was born here. Oh my gosh, this is how old I'm going to be. And that's what the temperature is going to be like. Or, oh, my grandchildren were born here. What are they going to experience when they're older? So, yeah, we are very egocentric. And I think that's what it is, that this is the slide that everybody looked at, Yvonne. Exactly. Where am I? Where are my kids going to be? Oh, that does not look good. So what can we do? All the things that related to climate change, what can we do? Well, we all know, as with many educators here, it's through education. That's how and it's through sharing those stories. Wanted to show the painting that I showed at the very beginning of Lawrence Paul's work and talking about Yuxue Lupton, talking about the killer whale has a vision, and he updated his piece recently to coming to check on the endangered killer whales in the Salish Sea. I just love these images. I think as teachers, we can share them with our students. And then a conversation that I thought was really important between Derek Jensen and we met him earlier in the slide when he talked about Against Forgetting with Indigenous scholar Vine Deloria, and it's about extinction. And Jensen asked him, so you've suggested that beautiful possibility that extinction might not be forever, but instead endangered creatures can go away, come back when their habitat is once again being treated properly. Wow, that was so powerful for me, because if we treat the area right, as Vine Deloria says, preparing the area right, and that would be giving them enough food, taking those toxins, the pollutants out of our waters, making sure that ships aren't in their way, then they may go away. And we have seen the numbers diminish, but they have the power to come back again. So I have to finish with a quote with Mary Oliver, and this is what we do as teachers. When we tell our stories, we're telling about it. We're telling these spark stories and we're sharing the spark stories. Pay attention and then be astonished and tell about it. That's what we do. And that's when we share stories. So many amazing teachers here. And just think of that idea of pedagogical witnessing. You're sharing the spark stories. That's your action. As teachers, teaching, we take action through sharing the stories, through pedagogical witnessing. We are taking action. And I'd just like to thank the Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center and UBC Sustainability. We've got more people coming up. Chris Harley in May, and then Ellen Kelsey in June. So the website will have more information for you. And I'd also like to thank Edith Lando for helping us put this together. And also David Robitaille STEM has also supported us, as well as UBC Sustainability. Lindsay Rogers and I are fellows, and Yvonne was working with us on this wonderful series. And then also through NSERC Promo Science. These are all support of what we did today. And some of the credits here, I always make sure everybody gets a credit for the wonderful photos. Most of the photos came from the Center for Whale Research, NOAA, Oceanwise, and also from Paul Nicklin, the orcas from Norway, and the wonderful artwork from Chief Ladybird and Lawrence Paul Yuxue. Thank you, everybody.